what I need to know is who spread the vicious rumors that there was no class today?
They won't admit it.
They won't, yeah. It's like I missed the 9 o'clock, I'm coming to the 11 o'clock, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, there's no class today. Yay! So to get today's lesson started, I thought we would have like a short quiz. So this is pretty easy. Okay, so who was the best Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle? Which one was the best one? Who? Wrong. Michelangelo, who else? No, wrong. Donatello, that leaves you with? Leonardo, yes. Very good. Okay, who painted the Mona Lisa? Yes, there you go. Okay, and then who designed the Sistine Chapel? Not Leonardo. There you go. And all this brings us to the Da Vinci exhibit up at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And Carla and I have been talking about this, and it was kind of funny. I can never keep track of her because she always changes the way she looks. So I was looking for her this morning because I wanted to touch base with her to see if this was a go or not. And it's like she walked right in front of me like 3 times before I saw it. I went, wait, that's... Anyways, on Monday, June 3rd, we're going to be doing a group trip up to see the Leonardo da Vinci exhibit at the Denver Museum. We went up last year and we saw the Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit, and that went really well. Now, the Leonardo exhibit isn't directly linked to biblical studies or Anglicanism or anything like this, but one of the things that's really important about it is just learning the culture and the history that we're part of. And Leonardo is one of those Renaissance people that really helped set the agenda for what we would call the modern program of thought that has really raised a lot of problems and questions for the church for the past 400 to 500 years, but it's worth seeing his exhibit and his place in time. So we'll be going up as a group on June 3rd, taking the exhibit, and then afterwards we have to see how plans form up. But we went out to lunch last time afterwards and had kind of a discussion on the exhibit. So that might be fun to do also. So put that in your calendar, mark it down, and we will have more information for you on that. So you're down for this, huh? Okay, good. All right. It's definitely well worth going. And the Denver Museum is a great museum. Unfortunately, my 11-year-old grandson, who is like a professional at the museum, last time we went up a little early. And I've got video of him walking around in front of me and Catherine with the map and saying, okay, first we're going to go here, and then we're going to go there, and then we're going to see this, and over here's this guy. Unfortunately, I don't have him this time to see it. One of the things that's really cool about it is that they do have a permanent exhibit on mummies that's well worth seeing. So when you're reading like the story of Joseph, that the Egyptian doctors embalmed his body, probably mummified him, and Israel's time in Egypt, it's worth seeing that in the culture and what took place and some of the writings that they have regarding that. And also they've got material in there in the mummies about ancient scribes, and that helps you understand the text and the writing of some of these ancient Israeli documents as well. So this week we are the first Sunday after Easter, and I don't get to teach fire and brimstone lessons anymore, which is really great. But we've got 3 texts today: Acts chapter 5, Revelation chapter 1, and John chapter 19. And even Reginald Fuller, in his book, Preaching the Lectionary, which gives you about 2 or 3 pages on the lectionary readings for that week and how they fit together and stuff like that, says at the very beginning for his write-up for this week that there really is no link between the readings this week. There is a slight one. It's that they're all concerned with the resurrection of Jesus somehow. But you could say that about any text in the New Testament, basically, and you'd be pretty good. It's like asking a child down in the Sunday school program, what's gray, has a fuzzy tail, lives in a tree, and eats nuts? And they know the answer is Jesus, because the answer to every question in Sunday school is always Jesus. Now, I really want to focus this week on Acts chapter 5 and John chapter 19. And the reason for that is they apply more directly to Easter and this time of year. This section from Revelation chapter 1 is really about the risen, glorified Lord, and this apocalyptic text that that section is used to introduce the book of Revelation. And I mean, it's got some really nice stuff, but Acts chapter 5 and John chapter 19 is more appropriate, so I'm going to spend most of my time, actually I'm going to spend all my time on those two texts. Now, Acts chapter 5. In Acts chapter 5, the thing that we need to realize is that the book of Acts opens with sort of a summary or a program statement in verse 8 of the first chapter. I was going to say first 8 of, in verse 8 of chapter 1. It opens with a statement, "Now you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the remotest parts of the earth." And the book of Acts tends to follow that schedule. The first 5 chapters are all about the apostles in Jerusalem. Then they go out to Judea and Samaria, sort of like the going from Colorado Springs to El Paso County. And then finally, by the end of the book, you're out to the remotest parts of the earth. Acts chapter 5 falls in this. What's taken place here is Peter and the other apostles have been preaching and teaching and healing people in the temple. And the temple was a large complex. It wasn't just the building that was the temple itself, but it had a large courtyard complex to it as well. And in that courtyard complex, you had covered areas called porticos. And that's where the different teachers would sort of set up shops. Gamaliel, Hillel, the different famous rabbis would have their students teach in these porticos. And this is probably when in John, when it talks about Jesus teaching in the temple, that's probably where he was teaching as well in the porticos. And in Acts chapter 5, we see the disciples doing that as well. Now, the Sanhedrin have them arrested because they've already warned them once that you're not to teach about Jesus anymore. But they're back in there. So chapter 5, verse 12 starts off, "Now many signs and wonders were regularly done among the people by the hands of the apostles. And they were all together in Solomon's portico," one of these porticos within the temple. Now, verses 13 through 16, we skip in the reading, basically because of time or length. We've already got one coming for the trip. He's right back there. Yes. Yes. But I want to read verses 13 through 16. It says, "Now, none of the rest dared join them." Now, this is probably talking about the wider Jewish population, that they're standing off from the Christian community there some. "But the people held them in high esteem. And more than ever, believers were added to the Lord, multitudes of both men and women, so that they even carried out the sick into the streets and laid them on cots and mats, that as Peter came by, at least his shadow might fall on some of them. The people also gathered from towns around Jerusalem, bringing the sick and those afflicted with unclean spirits, and they were healed." Now, there's an interesting little statement in here where it says that even his shadow might fall upon them. And this is going back to the Leonardo exhibit. To understand our history and our culture and the way people thought in the past is really important. Because when you hit a statement like this, we just kind of go, oh, there's some sort of superstition, or they think that maybe Peter's shadow might pass upon them. But there's actually a good reason for this. And the reason is that healing during that time was accomplished primarily by physical touch, putting your hands on people. This is where we get the word therapy from in English, therapeo from the Greek, to put your hands on someone and work them. And how we get the English word therapy. Now, how does this fit with the shadow? In the ancient world, they thought the shadow was part of you. So if my shadow touched you, it was kind of like, Joe Biden, coming along, and touching a person. And there are actually cases where people got killed or they got sued or taken to court because they would stomp on somebody else's shadow or pour or throw refuse on it because they thought they were actually throwing it on that person. So this is what's going on there. We look at it as, oh, this is just a weird idea. But for them, that was equivalent to Peter coming along and touching them with his hands type of thing. There's my little one with his shadow falling on them. Moving on to where we actually read, it says, "But the high priest rose up, and all who were with him, that is the party of the Sadducees, and filled with jealousy, they arrested the apostles and put them in public prison." Now this filled with jealousy, we always read that in a negative sense. Jealousy in the English language has a lot of negative connotations. In Greek, it's both positive and negative. It can be negative sense that I'm filled with rage over something you're doing, or I'm very zealous to make sure that you're not doing something wrong. And in this particular case, it probably looks like it's more, we need you to stop doing this because we're the people that have been appointed by God to make sure that all the rules are carried out and done correctly. It would be like if somebody starts selling the host wafers from communion at the back of the church for $1 each. As you're going in, Don would put his foot down pretty quickly and say, look, you are not authorized to do that. I'm the person that got put in charge here, and we're going to forbid your raising money for whatever by doing this. This is where they're at. So they arrested him and put him in public prison. But during the night, an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the prison and brought them out and said, "Go and stand in the temple and speak to the people all the words of this life." And when they heard this, they entered the temple at daybreak and began to teach. Now when the high priest came and those who were with him, they called together the council, all the senate of the people of Israel, and they sent to the prison to have them brought. But when the officers came, they did not find them in prison. So they returned and reported, "We found the prison securely locked and the guards standing at the door, but when we opened, we found no one inside." Now when the captain of the temple and the chief priests heard these words, they were greatly perplexed and wondered about what would come. Now in the book of Acts, one of the themes that you see in the book of Acts is that as the gospel spreads, it encounters opposition. And Luke probably records this because the early church, the churches that the book of Acts is going out to, are facing opposition in their various situations. So to talk about how Peter, James, and John get arrested and thrown into prison would have been something that these local congregations would have understood, because members of their congregation are being arrested or questioned or tortured for various reasons, and they want to see that, oh, this isn't just a fluke happening to us, this is what happened to the apostles in Jerusalem as well. So the church is standing continuity. The second thing about it is when people get arrested and thrown in prison, there's usually a trial afterwards where the apostles get to give some sort of really great speech and show how incredibly intelligent they are and overcome things. Now, the reason why Luke records these, there's 7 different trials in the book of Acts. The reason why he records these is that it then becomes like a handbook on how to defend yourself if you're arrested. So if you get arrested and the Jewish authorities are charging you with breaking the law of Moses before public authorities, oh, look, you have Paul's trial here on this. What if you get arrested and you get thrown in prison for preaching about Jesus and the local city authorities told you not to do it? Well, here's a great example where Peter, James, and John had the same type of thing. So it becomes sort of like a legal handbook in a certain sense. That's one of the ways this functions. But they have them arrested and thrown into prison. Now, one of the things that's interesting about this particular case is that the guards that are sent to retrieve Peter, James, and John and bring them before the Sanhedrin, they come up, and verse 24, it says, when they heard these words, they were greatly perplexed about them and wondering what would come. Now, later on in Acts chapter 12, you're going to have guards that are going to get arrested again because they arrested Paul at this time, I believe, and he escaped. But in that particular instance, what happens is the guards are put to death because the prisoner escaped. So what you see is a little bit of a social distinction here between guards that work for the Sanhedrin or the Jewish council, probably a higher level official. They just kind of wonder, what's going on? What's going to happen? Are we going to get chastised, docked away a month's wages? What's going to take place here? Where later on in chapter 12, when they're thrown into more of a civil prison and the prisoners escape, these are probably more like hired thugs that the magistrates hire to guard the prison. And when the people get away from them, they probably think, oh, they've been bribed, they were friends, family, or something like that, and they just execute them. So you see kind of a social distinction between the two that's taking place. The key thing that I think that's funny in this is that when you read this story, boy, I'm always one step ahead of myself today. It says, verse 25, and then someone came and told them, look, the men who you put in prison are standing in the temple and teaching the people. And it's just one of these, we arrested them, we threw them in prison, we told them not to do this, and then we send the guards there, and they're not there. And the Sanhedrin and the council are in the temple, and then somebody comes in, the guys you threw in prison, they're right outside. And they're doing what you told them not to do. So you really see this idea of opposition, but the opposition is ineffective when it comes to the spread of the gospel. It can't even keep somebody in prison in this particular story. Then the captain with all the officers went and brought them, not by force, for they were afraid of being stoned by the people. And when they brought them, they set them before the council, and the high priest questioned them, saying, we strictly charged you not to teach in his name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. Now what you get here is probably a very condensed version, sort of the Reader's Digest version of the trial here. That there was probably a lot more back and forth questioning and answering and different things like this. But it comes down to the high priest saying, we strictly charge you not to teach in his name. Yet here you are doing this. Now there's 2 points that are interesting in this. The first one is that the high priest says, we charge you not to teach in this name. And then towards the end he says, you intend to bring this man's blood upon us. The way Luke phrases the question here is really kind of interesting because it makes the high priest look like, he's trying to do everything possible to avoid mentioning the name of Jesus. Or B, when he talks about this name, Luke wants you to understand that as referring to the name of God, the name that can never be pronounced, the name that you couldn't write in the Old Testament, the name that is above every name. So by saying that we charge you not to teach in this name, there's this resonance of the name of God in the Old Testament, but then you also kind of get this, he's doing everything possible to avoid what's going on here. The third thing that's kind of interesting, and this is where my he questioned them came from here, is what happens in the early church is when they copy this sentence, it says here, and the high priest questioned them saying, but when you have the quote there, it's not a question, it's a statement. And so early copyists in the early church made that first line there, we strictly charge you not to teach in this name. They made that into a question. And all you have to do is just modify one verb a little bit to do it. And so it became, didn't we charge you not to teach in this name? Yet here you are, you fill Jerusalem with his teaching. So you see how the early copyists, they look at this and they go, oh, what's going on in the text here? It says he questioned them, but it's not a question. And then they go, oh, I know what happened. The guy before me copied it wrong. You know, he took this verb, instead of making it, you know, putting an oo with an indicative type thing, he just made it into a straight thing. He forgot two little letters and boom, you got this. But anyways, that's for free. Don's not going to charge you for that part. What's going on there? Let me make sure I've got everything here. Then we move on. Uh-oh, what happened there? We lost a section there. I lost a slide. Immediately after this, it then says that the high priest was filled with rage against what the apostles had said. And the other thing is that Peter, when he replies to them the second time, he says that this Jesus who died for the sins of the whole world, who you killed on a cross. Now, in doing that, when Peter does it, the first thing to say, we must obey God rather than man, that's kind of a bold statement to make. But then the second thing is to flip the table here, instead of being the Sanhedrin being the judges and you being the accused, he flips the table here, and now he's accusing the Sanhedrin of something. And so it becomes one of these things where the way Luke writes the story here, it becomes very, very confrontational. The way he kind of edits it down and kind of takes best statements out of it and compresses it. It becomes this thing where it flips the stories of the Sanhedrin's guilty, the apostles are innocent. The other thing that I want to mention, and that I lost in the slide that disappeared here, was when Peter says, we must obey God rather than man. This is a text that has a long history in civil disobedience movements, the pacifist movement during the Reformation, with large swaths of Europe during the Reformation saying that we must obey God rather than man, therefore we're not going to join your armies. And so what happened is a lot of those particular Reformation movements became life impaired pretty quickly because the local princes and kings said, sorry, I need an army, and if you're going to teach this in your churches, you're no longer citizens here. And would just slaughter them wholesale. This is where the whole Anabaptist movement and the Mennonite movement got started. They had to flee from region to region because they were just getting slaughtered. The big thing for them was when they were charged with, you must fight in the army, you must take an oath to the king or various things like this, they would say, we must obey God rather than man, quoting from Peter's defense here. So it's something that has a long history. But it's also one of these statements that has a long history before it. You go all the way back to Plato. In his defense before the Athenian city council, they charged him with spreading the teachings of Socrates, and Plato's defense was, I have to obey God rather than man. In other words, he really thought that these teachings that he was passing on were divine in origin, and so he needed to stand up for it. Now, in that particular case, and in Plato's apology, the city council went, wow, look at the integrity of this guy, that he will stand on this issue and not back down. And so they recused him. They let him off. It wasn't like Socrates where they forced him to drink hemlock. So the statement there has a really long history. And by Peter making that statement, he falls within this long tradition of great heroes making a stand for what is right. And kind of incorporates this out of the Greco-Roman tradition into the Christian tradition. Now, the reason why that's interesting is that as the gospel spreads out into the Greco-Roman world, remember all these people that Luke and Paul are working with out there in Corinth and Athens and Rome and Ephesus, they're not Jewish by origin, they're pagan they're Greek by origin. And so they know the stories of Plato and various things like this. And so when Peter makes that quote and takes the stand that way, I think he particularly latches onto that line and says, this definitely goes in, because all of my Greco-Roman readers then would immediately go, wow, look, Peter's of the character of like Plato and these types of heroes that we've heard about all along. He falls into this great tradition of history. So, Acts chapter 5, you have post-resurrection experiences. The disciples are in the temple. They're teaching about the risen Lord. And there's a lot of interesting cultural things that happen there. This then brings us over to the Gospel of John, which I just realized, we'll see how far we make it through this one. We're running out of time here. I'm not going to read the text just for the sake of time. You've got it. You've read it in church, or if you haven't read it in church, you will read it during the next service. So you got that. There's a couple of things that are really interesting here in John's account of the resurrection. The first thing is, when you read the resurrection appearances, you'll notice that Jesus appears and disappears all over the place. When he appears in the upper room, he doesn't leave by the door. He's gone. He doesn't climb in through the window. He's just in the room. When they're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee, all of a sudden there he is. On the road to Emmaus, he's there and then he's not there. So these resurrection appearances are quite interesting as far as how he's appearing and disappearing all over the place. The other thing is that often the people who meet him and have these experiences, they don't recognize him, which is a really interesting aspect to these stories. And you'll find the different commentators and authors trying to explain how come the disciples on the road to Emmaus didn't recognize who Jesus is. How come Mary in the Garden of Gethsemane, in the garden where the tomb is, when she goes to find him and she meets Jesus, she thinks he's a gardener. How come a lot of times the disciples don't recognize who Jesus is when he meets them? Even Peter on the Sea of Galilee, when he's out fishing and he sees somebody on the shore and the guy's calling to them, and they're like, who is this guy? Why is he? And then all of a sudden Jesus calls him by name and Peter goes, it's the Lord. Now he recognizes him. So there's this element of they recognize him but they don't recognize him. He also has wounds in his body, with the whole story of Thomas. Here, stick your hand here in my wound, and see that it's me. So he's got wounds, but they're not inflicting bodily harm or injury to him. He's got this gaping wound in his side, but he's not bleeding or losing his life from it. Let me see. Later on in the New Testament, this is where Revelation chapter 1 comes in. And by that time in the story, Jesus has ascended into heaven, and now he's received a glorified body. And so you read Revelation chapter 1, and he's shining, and he's holding 7 stars in his hands, and he's sitting on 7 hills, and he has a voice like trumpets. You all of a sudden realize now things have really changed in this whole thing. And this brings up issues about the resurrection and the nature of the resurrected body. And you can read more of this in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, where Paul spends an entire chapter talking about it. But one of the big things to realize is that when we think about Jesus' resurrected body, which is a model or an image for us to think about ours, there's both continuity and discontinuity between the two. A, we're embodied now, we'll be embodied then. But B, will it be the same body, type of body, flesh and bones, blood, sinew, and type of things like this. And when we read the resurrection appearances of Jesus, it really doesn't look that way, because flesh and blood doesn't pass through walls, bop from here to there all over the place. And also, we're going to bear some things that will give us some identity. So like Jesus' gash in his side, there appear to be things that we'll have from this life that will allow others to identify us in the life to come. But at the same time, all these accounts where people see Jesus, but they don't recognize who he is, there's also some things that lead us to think that, okay, maybe there's some things that are going to change bodily or physically in our appearance. You know, maybe all of you guys will suddenly find yourself on a very godly height stature, you know. I think 2 meters tall is the biblical standard, you know, in heaven. For all the guys, definitely a godly beard will appear. Pardon me? Yes, and we'll all be average, yes. But it raises these questions. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about all this is that the biblical text doesn't nail down exactly what the resurrected body will be. In fact, Paul talks about, he says, look at the birds, the fish, the animals, all these different types of bodies that God's created. If he's so creative that way, he can be really creative in that we have an earthly body and a heavenly one. He says, here we have a fleshly body, there we'll have a spiritual one. Here we have a mortal body, there we'll have an immortal one. But he doesn't sit down and specify exactly what it will be like. He gives you some trajectories of thought along these lines, but doesn't nail it down exactly. It's not like the Quran or various teachings like this, where it says this is what your resurrected body will be like. Or some of the Eastern traditions where it says we'll be like a disembodied spirit and we'll all, you know, go off into the ether. It's like the Buddhist who goes up to the hot dog vendor on the street. And he asks them, I need you to make me one with everything. Didn't work, did it? Catherine's better at telling it. Anyways, Buddhists, you know, going to nirvana where you're one with everything. Yeah, okay, that totally failed. The big idea here is that there's continuity and discontinuity, and we see that in the resurrection appearances. The other thing that we see here is that when he first meets them, he says, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. 2 big ideas. First is this idea of peace be with you. This is off the Old Testament idea of shalom. And it's not just existing in a state of there's no contention between people, but shalom is to be in a state of community and peace with those around you. It's a community term. If you ever get to travel in the Middle East, the big greeting there is salam, or salam alaikum, and then you reply wa alaikum salam back to them. But salam is the Arabic word for shalom in the Hebrew. So even in their culture today, this big idea that when you greet someone, you extend shalom or peace to them, is this idea of not that I'm not going to argue with you, but now you're part of my community, and we're all kind of in this big community of peaceful coexistence together with one another. So Jesus coming up and saying, peace with you, is the first statement that there's this new formation of community. Then the second idea is the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. John Stonestreet in his sermon on Easter was talking about how Luke and Acts are part A and part B of the same volume. In the book of Luke, it's about God's ministry through Jesus on earth. In the book of Acts, it's about God's ministry through the church in Jesus' name to the world. And so you get this pairing. John does the same type of thing here, where Jesus was sent, he accomplished his ministry. Now the end of his gospel opens up with, now I am sending you. And the big idea is that what Jesus did, now he wants us to be doing. And then we have another big statement that comes across here, where he says, and when he had said this, he breathed on them, and he said to them, receive the Holy Spirit. Now this word breathed on is an interesting one, because it's not just kind of like a little. Oftentimes this word fusio means to really kind of puff something up, to really blow it up big. And to breathe into or to breathe on something is to really give them like a really big breath of air. Now, where this becomes really crucial is that in Genesis chapter 2, when God creates Adam, It said, then the Lord formed the man out of the dust from the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living creature. Okay, little spelling thing there. What happens is when you copy the ESV over, the English Standard Version over, they've got these little footnotes in letters, and sometimes the spell checker picks them up. It tells you, oh, there's a Q in front of the word the. In this particular case, it didn't pick it up, so the little E got in front of the there. But in Genesis, this idea that God breathed into man, and when they translated the Hebrew into Greek, they used this Greek word emphusio to talk about it. It's not a common word in the Bible at all. When it comes over into John chapter 19, and it says, Jesus says he breathed on them, this is definitely an echo back to Genesis chapter 2. It's not used in many places, but the idea here is going straight back to it. And the basic idea here is that this breathing into and putting the Spirit, which we kind of miss the connection here. In the Greek, the word for Holy Spirit is like holy breath or holy wind. That he breathed on them, and in Genesis it talks about that the breath of life or the Spirit of life came into man. The same thing here with the disciples, that now Jesus breathes on the disciples and the Holy Spirit comes into them. And what you have is, it's like John's playing with this idea. In Genesis 1, you have the creation of humankind. And in John chapter 19, you have the creation of a new humankind, the church. And it gets started during that time. What's really kind of interesting about this whole thing, where he talks about he breathed on him and he said, receive the Holy Spirit here. This is sort of John's version of Acts chapter 2 when the Holy Spirit comes upon the church. Uh-oh, I just saw Michael Williams stand up in there. That means I'm running out of time. He's going to stand at the back and glower at me. He'll probably breathe on me really strong, as only a bishop can. That John here does a very condensed version of Acts chapter 2. This is about the most he goes into it. Boom, right there, and that's all he's got to say. Then you have the story of Thomas, who's called one of the twins, and he comes up and he said, they see him and they say, unless I see his hands and the marks of the nails and place my finger in his side, I will never believe. And then Jesus appears to him and he says, look, Thomas, do this. And then Thomas cries out, my Lord and my God. Now, in Matthew's gospel, you have Jesus asking, who do men say I am? And Peter says, thou art the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus says, blessed are you, Peter. Peter makes the good confession in Matthew's gospel. In John's gospel, you have Martha making it at the tomb of Lazarus. She cries out, my Lord and my God. And then you get Thomas making it here at the very end, crying out, my Lord and my God. And so the resurrection of Lazarus and then Jesus himself are the two big things in the Gospel of John that really prove that Jesus is the risen Lord, that he is the Savior of the world, and why we worship him as the Lord God. Now, I'm going to move quickly here. A couple of things summary-wise about the gospel accounts and the post-resurrection experiences. These really set the resurrection account in the Gospels apart from ancient literature. The first one is doubt on the part of witnesses. In ancient literature, when someone does a miracle or something fantastic, in Greco-Roman or over in the region of modern-day Iraq, Iran, or down in Egypt with the various gods there, when a miracle is performed, the people don't run around going, I don't believe it. That never happened. How can you say something like this? But one of the things you see in the gospel accounts is all of the disciples. Mary goes to the tomb, sees the Lord, comes back to the disciples and says, he's alive. And they're like, you're whacked out. There's no way. Then they see the risen Lord, and Thomas goes, you guys are nuts. And this is a common pattern in the gospel accounts. And this is important because going back as far as the 1700s, different people tried to discount the resurrection, saying, oh, these were just visions. Or the disciples felt guilty about abandoning Jesus on the cross, and so they made up these visions to kind of relieve their guilt. Well, the whole thing that Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and even Paul records, that nobody believed this happened, that they were all filled with doubt, just totally rips that whole theory to shred. Why put that in if you've got this? The second thing is, no one saw the resurrection happen. Now, this is really odd. We saw the transfiguration. Mary and Joseph were there for his birth. They saw his death on the cross. They saw other miracles he performed. They're going to see his ascending into heaven. But the resurrection itself, no one saw. Now, if you were going to make up a story about somebody being raised from the dead, it would make great sense to have a witness or two to see it. You know, oh, there was sparkling, this light, you heard a loud sound, boom, all these things happen. Instead, what we got is guards at the tomb going, whoa, something happened here, and they fall down like dead men. That's the closest you come. Doesn't tell you what they saw, what they heard, or anything. They're outside the tomb. They don't see what happens inside. But they fall down like dead people. So this is another thing that's very interesting. If you were going to make up the resurrection story, this is not what you would leave out of the story. It lends veracity to the story. The other thing is that you get this bodily nature of the resurrection in John. In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Paul's writings, you could really get the idea that it was just visions. And this is why John's so important as a gospel, because he gets written about 20 to 30 years after the other ones. And he says, you know, look, we've got these ideas where Jesus was just raised as a spirit, that is a disembodied spirit. And so he goes back and he tells you the stories about these physical encounters, especially this one with Thomas. I mean, this is another one of these things. If you want to prove the resurrection is true, why put that story in there? It just doesn't make sense at all. But he really emphasizes this bodily resurrection. And then finally you get this, how do you believe in the resurrection? Because we're not around. We're not there with eyewitnesses. And in John's account, which I didn't have time to go into, he talks about how blessed are those who believe even though they didn't see. And that's a statement that's directly addressed to us. That is through the word that we come to believe in the resurrection. And I'm going to close there. Definitely. I've got 2 minutes. And so, I don't get to answer questions because I have to go to church today. But I hope you enjoyed it, and I will catch you next week. And remember the Da Vinci field trip that we're having. Carla's the key person on this. I just do what she says. All right? Yes.